that mostly this evening I'm going to be talking about jealousy. Not entirely, but mostly. But I do want to say that if you show up tomorrow for the workshop, there's going to be a lot of focus on envy then. So, it of course is not actually all that always clear about just what the difference between envy and jealousy is. And I was struck when I first looked this up that even my very good dictionary presents them as synonyms. But there is actually a difference. Envy, in kind of simple terms, is wanting something someone else has and you don't. It's kind of a two-person thing, or actually, maybe very often, a one-person thing, because the other may very often not have a clue as to what's going on in you, right? Whereas jealousy is the fear of losing something, or actually almost always of losing someone to whom you're attached, that you think you have a pretty solid connection to. And though it's not always sexual, it usually is. Especially if we adopt that Freudian expansion of what we include within our understanding of sexual. Where, as most of you probably know for Freud, he uses the term sexual to refer to all intimate and intense emotional interpersonal relationships. Okay, so anyway, jealousy is erotic, and it's a three-person thing. Me, my beloved, another. It's a triangle. And triangles, as I imagine you remember, Hillman was always trying to bring us to recognize that what brings energy into a relationship. The third is what enlivens the relationship. As, for example, it's Hades showing up to intrude between Demeter and Persephone that makes that a story. As long as you have Persephone and Demeter just sending love back and forth, it's beautiful. But there's no story, right? Nothing's happening. It takes a third. The presence of the third changes things. It stirs up deeper emotions: anger, grief, fear, betrayal, revenge, guilt. So there's a difference. But of course, it's not always this clear. And I often surprise myself, even after having put this lecture together, by misusing both words. But as I was putting this talk together, I thought of an example that might help clarify. It helps me clarify, anyway. It involves those two biblical sisters, Leah and Rachel. Rachel, who is barren, is envious of Leah's having given birth to her many children. She envies Leah those children. Whereas Leah is deeply jealous of Rachel, whom Jacob loves, whom Jacob loves as he does not love her. So the words do mean different things if we take the time to reflect on them. But again, I find it interesting that the Latin term, invidia, is translated both words. And I find it interesting that this word, invidia, is based on the Latin verb videre, to see. I like how it suggests that envy and jealousy are somehow connected to seeing. In fact, invidia is sometimes translated as meaning seeing too closely or seeing in a hostile manner. And how, to push this just a little further, it suggests, as Proust shows us so powerfully, how jealousy spurs us to see, to look in such an obsessive and detailed and imaginative kinds of ways. In Dante, envy is the sin that looks with grudging hatred upon other men's gifts and good fortune, which makes it perfect that in purgatory, the envious are radically deprived of sight. Their eyes get sewn shut with iron wire. It's also worth noting, and some of you may have gotten here already, that the word invidious means inspiring hostility. And I'm going to pick up on that a bit later, on the hint that perhaps we are in part responsible when someone feels jealous of us. Invidious, inspiring hostility. So, envy and jealousy have much in common. But it's clear to me that jealousy is the one that interests me, that pulls me. There's something about the word itself that pulls me, that feels sexy, red hot, transformative, core. So, of course, I had to look that word up too. The oldest meaning given in the Oxford English Dictionary refers to jealousy as simply meaning intense, vehement feeling, as though it's the intensity, not any particular content, that's at issue. And it seems relevant that in English, jealous and zealous were originally the same word. And some of you who are familiar with your King James Version of the Bible will remember that Yahweh is always presented as being very zealous, but actually he's very jealous. And this emphasis in the original English meaning of the word, that it signifies intensity, suggests to me that a twinge of jealousy isn't jealousy. That so-called normal jealousy, conscious, rational, moderated jealousy, it's not jealousy. That real jealousy is pathological, intense, archetypal, which is what I meant by calling it red hot. And it's kind of fun that the OED then goes on to speak of the jealous person as suspiciously watchful. Again, that seeing emphasis. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. When I first decided I wanted to really explore why the theme of jealousy had for me so much energy attached to it, I vaguely remembered that once long ago, I'd written an essay. I had written an essay about the depth psychological understanding of jealousy. So, of course, I went back and found it and read it. It's a piece I put together over 40 years ago. And you know what? I still think it's a good piece. And some of the things I said then, I'll say again tonight, but differently. What it is, it's a pretty good scholarly account of Freud's, and to a lesser degree, Jung's take on jealousy. But actually, it's not, I've come to realize, a depth psychological account. That is, it's not experiential. There's nothing in it about what it feels like to be overcome by jealousy. In this perfectly good piece, there's no I, there's no Chris in the essay. There are no stories. It's very abstract. So in a way, I would say now, it's not about jealousy at all. It's about some other people's ideas about jealousy. It's about depth psychology, but it's not depth psychological. Do you get what I mean? Okay. So, but I'm not sure, or I wasn't sure when I put this together that you would immediately get what I mean. So I'm going to explain a little bit more clearly exactly what I mean. In the clinical program at Pacifica, I get to teach the Introduction to Depth Psychology course to the first-year students. And one of the main things I'm trying to do in that course is to get across the difference between accepting the idea of the unconscious as a theoretical construct and experiencing being hit by it. Hit not by the unconscious, but by parts of myself that don't feel like they're me at all. And yet are undeniably insisting that they are. Okay. So I try to help my students see how easy it is to expect, especially if you're enrolled in a depth psychology program, right? How easy it is to accept that, yeah, there's an unconscious. Yeah, of course. And of course, yeah, I have an unconscious. But how different that is from being hit by the unconscious, by my unconscious, in ways that we're utterly unprepared for, that shatter us, that force us to realize that we are not who we thought we were. And even that now we may not be at all sure just who we are. So when teaching Freud and Jung in that introductory course, I focus very little on their theories or their therapeutic modalities. We don't spend a whole lot of time on making sure everybody understands the anima and the animus and personas and extrovert and introvert and feeling and thinking and the self and all of that. I assure the students they'll get lots of that as they make their way through the curriculum. But rather, when I'm teaching Freud and Jung, I try to focus on their experience of being hit in this way. In Freud's case, as some of you may remember, when his father died, which propelled him to a self-analysis. In Jung's, when the relationship between Freud and himself ruptured, which issued in what in Memories, Dreams, Reflections he called his confrontation with the unconscious, an experience that we now have access to a much rawer version of in the Red Book. For both, everything, really everything, followed from those experiences, which didn't just change their futures, but in a real way changed their pasts. That is, their understanding of their childhood, their adolescence, their early adult years. Because, neither of them was young when this happened. Freud was 40, Jung just a year or two short. And when I get around later this evening to talking about me, I'll be focusing on how I was hit in a similar way, sort of a similar way, when I was more or less that same age, when I was 37. Anyway, rereading that long ago book helped me to realize that I now want to look at and then talk about jealousy in what I would take to be a more genuinely depth psychological way. That is, to talk about what it's like to experience jealousy as an event. And to my mind, that means telling stories. Stories. Accounts of the experience of feeling jealous in that big deal way, that red hot way that I was speaking of a moment or so ago. Experiences of feeling jealous or of being viewed jealously by another. Since, of course, that also is an experience of jealousy. So this time, I want to tell stories. My own stories, but also to at least refer to some more archetypal stories, to some Greek myths. For that's another thing that's missing from that earlier essay, that good essay of 40 years ago. Myths, no myths. Despite the close intertwining between depth psychology and mythology that Freud and Jung and Hillman all insist upon. Myths, to my mind, are important in at least two ways. They remind us that narrative is the most telling, the most communicative way to express, to share existential truths. So that's one thing. And the other is that they help us recognize that our own stories are never just ours, that there's always a transpersonal aspect. So discovering the connection, again, concretely, not just theoretically, between, let's say, my experience and that represented in the myths associated with Hera and how jealous she is over and over again of all those many other females, divine and mortal, that Zeus gets involved with, right? The relationship between those stories and our own story. Or Medea's murderous rage. I mean, we know, really murderous rage at Jason's plans to supplant her with that Corinthian princess. Or Hephaestus's jealousy of the passion that brings Aphrodite and Ares together. Or, in turn, Aphrodite's jealousy of Psyche, the beautiful maiden with whom her son is infatuated. Her jealousy that she's going to lose her son to him. So what I'm trying to suggest is I'm not going to elaborate on all these stories. I'm just hinting at them, and I imagine that most of the ones I've alluded to are familiar enough that you can take it a little bit further. But I think engaging with those kinds of stories can be an important part of amplifying our own experience and thus responding to our own experience in a depth psychological way, of engaging in the process that Hillman describes as transposing experience into event. Transposing experience into event. That is recreating it, right? And always, I would say, retrospective process. And did you hear that seeing word in retrospective? Right? Okay. Big experiences, we all know this, big experiences, transformative experiences, aren't over when they're over. We keep working them, they keep working us. And this reworking is a creative process. in a sense, it's art. Which is why there's another kind of story that also can play an important role in opening us to a depth psychological understanding of jealousy. Not just my stories, not just ancient myths, but also the stories found in great literature. For great artists have exactly this gift of turning their experience into stories that illuminate our own. And the master here, as regards jealousy, is of course Marcel Proust, about whom I'll have a few things to say towards the end of this talk. But in another setting, in another context, one could do a whole lecture on jealousy just based on Proust. But for now, I'm going to go back again to that long ago essay. On rereading it, I was quite amazed to see how easily I agreed to follow Freud in looking at jealousy primarily as experienced by men. Back then, I'm talking about over 40 years ago, I didn't really take into account that it might look really different from a female perspective. But I seemed then to have been quite content to just leave it there, to stay with the guys, as though that might somehow be the normative pattern. And Freud really does stay with the guys, as toward the end of the essay, he suggests that what's really going on when it looks as though a man is focused on his adulterous wife is that he's really focused on the other man. That the real energy is between them. Okay, you can see how that might be. Yet obviously, if I want to speak of the role jealousy has played in my life, I need to recognize that my experience is a woman's experience, and for the last 30 years or more, a lesbian woman's experience. So a month ago or so, I was happy, sort of happy, to find a book by one of my favorite contemporary classicists, an Italian woman called Giulia Sissa. And she called her book Jealousy, a Forbidden Passion, that focuses on the female experience of jealousy, and that indeed sees it, because jealousy involves suffering, as an essentially feminine experience, even when experienced by men. Because of this, the way in which we divide things up, this is feminine and this is masculine, and being vulnerable and suffering and so on is a feminine thing in that kind of context. Now, I have to actually say I was delighted to find the book, and I was a little disappointed in the book by someone whose other books I really loved. But she seemed to be spending most of the book defending her own right to have been angry, pissed. She never cops enough to let us know exactly what happened. So there's this big whole mystery in the book, but you just keep reading page after page that she's giving women permission to be pissed, at what men do to them, right? Yeah. And she does something else that is very easy to do, which is that she too stays within a heteronormative kind of context. Okay, so all these things that were not quite there in that early essay that would have made it genuinely depth psychological. But there's yet another way, I think a very important way, in which I would now fault that early essay. This one, paradoxically, is that it's too depth psychological. That is, it's implicitly all about me. Well, about us. It's implicitly all about our inner lives, our souls. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the focus is almost entirely intra-psychic. But, as I noted at the very beginning, jealousy typically involves 3 persons, not just one. But you see, that's what depth psychology so often does. It reduces the experience, an interpersonal experience, to an inner one. And as I hope to show, one of the things jealousy can open us to is the reality of our inevitable entanglement with others, and the reality of those others as other. The reality of those others as other. That is, I've come to realize how important it is to distinguish between jealousy and jealous feelings. A long line suggested by an essay by Martin Buber that I came across decades ago called Guilt and Guilt Feeling. And in that essay, he's talking about guilt, and I'm talking about jealousy. But he's making essentially exactly the same point. The place of guilt, he writes, is not the soul, but the relationship between the self and the human world. Guilt is truly known when we recognize it not as something that takes place only within the individual as a feeling, but between person and person, as an occurrence, as a dramatic event. Buber, like Hillman, realizes that a real coming to terms with guilt or jealousy is always a long, drawn-out, never quite complete, retrospective process. It's memoria. It depends on memory, on remembering. The point, Buber said, is not so much to penetrate behind the conscious memory to a repressed reality, but simply to recall an occurrence as reliably, concretely, and completely as possible, unreduced and undissected. Buber is also persuaded that what is to be said about a theme, guilt or jealousy, cannot ever be fully detached from what he calls the teaching event. Thus, when he speaks of original guilt as remaining within oneself, he is always still aware of the sign, the image of the place and the moment in which that knowledge came home to him, in which he was brought face to face with his own guilt. This is the moment, it's a moment that's probably familiar to any of you who know Buber at all, that in between man and man, he calls a conversion, where he talks about how one day, towards the beginning of the First World War, he had gone upstairs after breakfast, as he did almost every morning, to his meditation room and spent an hour by himself. And when he came downstairs, his wife told him that in the meanwhile, a young man had come to the door and kind of stammered and said he didn't have an appointment, but he desperately needed to see Buber. And so she said that she'd led him into the salon or whatever. And Buber goes in and spends an hour or so talking with this young man and feels they've had a perfectly, good conversation. And some months later, he learns that this young man who was on his way to the front had been killed. And that the man had confided to the friend who'd encouraged him to go see Buber that he'd been really disappointed by what had happened between them. And it turned out that the young man hadn't really known himself what it was he hoped for from Buber, but he was just all torn up with all kinds of questions and concerns and fears and so on. And he'd hoped that Buber would be able to be present with him in a way that would bring that all into a kind of focus that he couldn't bring it to himself. And Buber felt, as he reflected on his experience, that even though in a kind of surface kind of way he'd been there, he hadn't really been fully present. Part of him was still sort of engaged with whatever had gone on in that hour of meditation. And he'd been in the room, but he hadn't been there with all of who he was. And he says that at that moment, he felt that he needed to turn from what he calls ecstasy to the everyday. That he sort of discovered by this meeting that didn't happen, right? How absolutely core in human life are those moments when we are able to be fully present with one another in what we've kind of all learned from Buber to call an I-you or an I-thou kind of way. So that visit from the young man was for Buber what we would call a traumatic event, one that remains numinous just because it was not fully lived, because it failed. It remained in the past, but is still living, still gathering affect about it. And retrospectively, Buber could weave together past and present. He could bring that past into the present with renewing power. But the event, that morning, the story, always remained an integral part of his understanding of guilt. As my stories, the stories I'm going to turn to eventually, are integral to my understanding of jealousy. But just as Buber's story is not just about him, but about the young man, so my stories, too, are not going to be simply about me. Though I have to say it took me a while, a long while, to really understand that. Freud is so goddamn right. Really coming to terms with our finitude. That is, with the fact that we live in a world of others. An inescapable relationship to the desires and needs of others is a lifelong, ever needing to be renewed task. We hate this, and we are fulfilled about it. We will, I believe, with part of ourselves, always resist, always want to return to the blissful challenge-free relationship. Part of us always still wants to return to that blissful, challenge-free relationship that we imagine we once had. In the beginning, in the womb, or at the breast. I think, for instance, of how Demeter, when Persephone returned to her after her long sojourn in Hades, imagined that now she and her daughter could simply go back to being the mother and daughter they had once been. It's really hard for her to come to terms with the fact of how impossible that is. I think, too, of how angrily Antigone, in the first scene of Sophocles' amazing play, completely rejects her sister Ismene. When that sister, whom in the very first line of the play she addresses as self-same, reveals that she has a different understanding of how they should respond to Creon's edict forbidding burial of their brother Polynices. For Antigone, even though Ismene is her only still living relative, if she's not 100% in agreement with Antigone, she's just no longer part of Antigone's family. That complete inability to brook otherness, right? Yeah. So one of the problems with the assumption of some depth psychologists that jealousy is in large measure delusional, phantasmal, that it's happening in me, in my soul, in my imagination, is that it completely ignores what's going on outside our soul. Ignores the others that are a part of the event. I want to take this a bit further. I've come to believe that the others are part of the event, even if we never do anything to make our jealousy visible, even if we never act it out. When I was initially put that in, and I thought I'm going to run short of time, which I'm not going to, it turns out, I was reminded of something that I once heard about the Sonoy tribe. Now, I think it's turned out since that it's not true, okay? You know, it's some anthropologist that sort of, but anyway, I like what the fantasy was, you know? And the idea that we were all given about what the Sonoy do is that if you have a dream about someone, if you're a Sonoy, it's absolutely incumbent on you that the very next morning to come to that neighbor or relative or whoever and tell them about the dream. You know, out of the kind of sense that in some way that dream does really pertain to them, even though we do all this depth psychological stuff that they're always just parts of ourselves, right? Well, we do. But that if I had this dream about you, and in this dream I was having these feelings and doing these things about you, that in some kind of way is from thenceforward part of what happens between you and me. Do you see? Now, it turns out, as I say, that the Sonoy people probably didn't really do this. But it's a way of it's a way of suggesting that even if we don't actually go and tell our friend about the dream, our relationship with that friend has been subtly changed, maybe just a little bit, but has been subtly changed by my having had that dream, right? And in a bigger deal kind of way, if I'm having some really intense feelings like jealousy, and I hold it in myself because I'm so grown up and big and all of that, it's still really affecting what's going on, right? Yeah. So I think that's important to know. So all of this leads me to suggest that if we can fully enter into our own experience of jealousy, we can deepen not just ourselves, but also the relationships maybe even with both of the others who are part of the story. Because remember, jealousy is a three-person event. And indeed, what I want to emphasize tonight is the creative, because potentially destructive, aspect of jealousy. I'm going to say that again because it's kind of paradoxical, but it's pretty core to what I'd like to say. That jealousy, if we can really allow ourselves to enter into our experience and really get a sense of how potentially destructive everything that's going on is, right? If we can go to the destructive part, maybe we can then get to a creative aspect as well. And the stories I'm going to tell, I hope, may make this idea a little bit more clear. So again, what I'm going to be talking about is when jealousy gets big, when jealousy takes us over. That is about what we might call pathological jealousy, the jealousy that brings big suffering, big with a capital B, and suffering with a capital S. I read somewhere, and I wish I knew where, because I think this is a great line. Jealousy is not a barren vice. Jealousy is not a barren vice. And the point, I've come to believe, is not to get over it, but to go into it. So, in a moment or two, we're going to have a break. And after that, I'm going to center the rest of my presentation on two stories, both of which come from my own life, both of which are big stories, both about experiencing jealousy in a way that threatened to take over my life. Okay? But which, like big dreams, have continued and indeed continue to reverberate, to reveal ever new meanings. The first is about another's jealousy of me. That is the experience of being the object of another's jealousy. The second is about an experience of my own jealousy. I was struck in that book by Giulia Sissa that I was in many ways disappointed by her suggesting that while envy tends to be silent, jealousy is talkative. That the person suffering with jealousy wants to talk about it, wants you to know what she or he is feeling, wants validation. That makes sense to me. And yet, it makes sense to me, and yet I'm not actually sure if it really fits my own experience. Because these stories I'm going to tell are not stories I talked about when I was in the midst of the experience. That's something that River is always calling me on, that I'm ready to share my experiences, but only after I've had a chance to digest them for quite a while, right? So strangely, even today, the first of these two stories that I'll be sharing pretty soon, though it goes back almost exactly 50 years now, still feels the more important. But as I get ready to tell these stories, I want to talk for a moment first about Jenny Offel's fictional account of her jealousy in her fine Department of Speculation book. Has any of you read this book? It's a tiny little book, but it's really fine. And what particularly struck me in this book is what I, as a once upon a time English major, would call one of its structural features. What really impressed me was how, in the first pages, the narrator speaks of herself in the first person and of her husband as you. But during most of the book, when her husband's affair is in full swing and she's overcome by jealousy, she speaks of herself as she, as the wife, and of him as the husband. And it's only after they've come to some mode of reconciliation at the very end of the book that she's once again writing of me and you and us. I found this a wonderful way of communicating how, when in the grip of the jealousy archetype, both we and the others involved become more objects than persons. And this forces me to realize how important it is for me to remember this when I get around to telling my stories after our break.